In August 2005, a marine geophysicist at the European Institute for Marine Studies in Plouzané, France, published a paper in the journal Geology that stopped a lot of people in their tracks. His name was Marc-André Gutscher, and what he reported was this: 60 meters beneath the surface of the Gulf of Cadiz, just west of the Strait of Gibraltar, there is a submerged island. It used to be above water, roughly 70 square kilometers of inhabitable land, sitting exactly where Plato said Atlantis sat. Around 12,000 years ago, a magnitude 9 earthquake struck the region. Gutscher found evidence of it in the sediment record. An unusually thick turbidite, a layer of displaced debris dated to approximately that moment. A tsunami followed. The island, already shrinking as post-Ice Age sea levels rose, went under, in what could, if you squinted at it hard enough, be described as a single catastrophic event. Plato wrote that Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune by earthquakes and floods. He said it lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles as the Strait of Gibraltar. He said it sank into the sea. Gutscher found an island in that exact location destroyed by exactly those forces at roughly the time Plato described, and it still wasn't Atlantis, not even close. And the reasons why tell you something far stranger than any lost city could. Here's the paradox. Atlantis is not an obscure legend dug up by amateur enthusiasts. It comes from one of the most rigorous philosophical minds in Western history. Plato, writing in 360 BC in 2 dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. Plato gave Atlantis a specific location, a specific size, larger than Libya and Asia combined, he wrote, a specific date of destruction, approximately 9,600 BC. A specific cause, earthquakes and floods. A specific political structure. A specific layout of concentric rings of land and water. Specific metals mined from its soil. This is not the vagueness of myth. This is the precision of someone describing a place they believe existed, and yet, in 2,400 years of searching, with sonar, with satellite imaging, with deep-sea submersibles, with high-resolution bathymetric mapping of the entire ocean floor, nobody has found it. The question isn't just why we haven't found Atlantis. The question is whether not finding it means it doesn't exist, or whether we've been looking in the wrong way, for the wrong reasons, guided by a misunderstanding of what Plato was actually doing when he wrote it down. Plato says he heard the story from his relative Critias, who heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais sometime around 590 BC. Priests who claimed their records went back 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing Atlantis at roughly 9,600 BC. Every serious location hypothesis has had to reckon with that chain of transmission, 5 steps spanning roughly 250 years from Solon to Plato before anything was written down. The most popular hypothesis for most of the 20th century was the Santorini hypothesis. In the 1930s, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, who would go on to excavate Akrotiri, a Minoan city buried under volcanic ash on the island of Thera, in what he called the most important classical excavation since Pompeii, argued that the Minoan civilization's catastrophic collapse was triggered by the volcanic eruption of Thera around 1600 BC. That eruption, one of the largest in recorded human history, ejected roughly 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, generated tsunamis that reached heights of tens of meters along Mediterranean coastlines, and buried Akrotiri under meters of pumice. A sophisticated island civilization destroyed suddenly by catastrophic geological events, with a city preserved beneath volcanic debris. Marinatos saw the parallel to Plato and made the case explicitly. The Minoan civilization was Atlantis. Thera was its destruction. The hypothesis became enormously influential, and it has one fatal flaw that nobody has been able to get around. The dates don't match. Plato says Atlantis was destroyed around 9,600 BC. The Thera eruption was around 1,600 BC, 8,000 years too late. Proponents of the Santorini hypothesis have suggested Plato's Egyptian source made an error, accidentally multiplying the date by 10, not 9,000 years before Solon, but 900, which would put the event at roughly 1,500 BC, close enough to Thera. But there is no evidence for that mistranslation. It is an assumption invented specifically to make the dates fit. This is the pattern that has repeated itself across every Atlantis hypothesis for 2,400 years. Find a civilization, find a disaster, adjust the numbers until they match, declare success. It never quite works. Here's what most people don't realize about Marc-André Gutscher's Spartelbank paper, the one with the magnitude 9 earthquake and the submerged island at Gibraltar. Gutscher himself eventually withdrew his support for it, not immediately, but after presenting his findings at the 2005 Atlantis conference, he heard the argument that convinced him his candidate didn't work. The problem was the same problem that sinks almost every Atlantis hypothesis eventually. Plato describes a Bronze Age civilization, a naval empire with metallurgy, architecture, political hierarchy, written law. The Spartel Island, even if it was inhabited before it sank 12,000 years ago, would have been occupied by, as Gutscher himself admitted, what he called simple fishermen. Pre-agricultural foragers with no cities, no navy, no technology that would have made them notable enough to appear in Egyptian records. Gutscher found the geology. He didn't find evidence of any culture at all. And here's where it gets strange. This is the fundamental problem with every serious geological candidate. The dates that match the geological record push Atlantis into a period before civilization existed anywhere on Earth. The dates that match a civilization push Atlantis into periods where the geology doesn't cooperate. There is no location on the planet where both conditions are simultaneously satisfied, which brings us to the third possibility, the one most classicists have believed for most of the last century, the one that gets the least airtime in documentaries, and the one that is almost certainly correct. Plato made it up. Not randomly, not arbitrarily, Plato constructed Atlantis as a philosophical thought experiment, a fictional archetype of a corrupt civilization designed to contrast with his ideal of Athens, drawn partly from real historical events he knew about, including possibly the Thera eruption, possibly the destruction of the city of Helike in 373 BC by an earthquake and tsunami, possibly Athens' own disastrous invasion of Sicily in 413 BC. Aristotle, Plato's own student who knew the man personally, reportedly joked about Plato's tendency to conjure nations out of thin air and then destroy them. The Roman geographer Strabo recorded the joke. No ancient Greek writer before Plato mentions Atlantis. Not one. In a culture that extensively documented its myths, its geography, and its history, there is a perfect silence on the subject until 360 BC, when Plato introduces it, and then other ancient writers immediately treat it with skepticism. Ignatius Donnelly was a former United States congressman from Minnesota who, in 1882, published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It sold out its first printing immediately and went through 23 editions. Donnelly had no formal training in archaeology, geology, or classical studies. What he had was an extraordinary ability to find connections between things and present them with absolute conviction. His argument was sweeping. Atlantis had been a real continent in the Atlantic Ocean, the source of all human civilization, whose refugees had populated ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Mesoamerica, and the civilizations of South Asia after the continent sank. The shared myths, the shared architectural styles, the shared cosmologies across cultures with no documented contact. Donnelly explained all of them with a single lost landmass. Every claim he made has since been refuted. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which he pointed to as the remnant of Atlantis, is not a sunken continent. It's a volcanic formation built upward from the ocean floor. The cultural parallels he cited were either coincidences, products of independent invention, or mischaracterized. Continental drift, which wasn't understood in his time, shows that no landmass large enough to have supported civilization has existed in the Atlantic in the time frame he described. But Donnelly's book didn't create a curiosity. It created an industry. He invented, essentially, the template for every Atlantis book, every Atlantis documentary, and every Atlantis theory that has followed for 140 years. Take a real mystery, add a lost civilization as the explanation, adjust the dates and geography until they almost fit, and present the whole thing with the confidence of a man who is absolutely certain he has solved something. He died in 1901 still convinced he was right. The search he sparked has never stopped. What's actually interesting about the Atlantis story, and what gets almost no attention, is what it reveals about how we process the past. Classicist Kenneth Feder at Central Connecticut State University, who has spent decades studying archaeological pseudoscience, has pointed out that Plato himself gives the game away inside the text of Timaeus. When Critias presents the Atlantis story to Socrates, he says, and this is in the dialogue, that it is remarkable how Solon's account of Atlantis agreed with the perfect society Socrates had described the previous day. Perfect agreement, a story that conveniently confirms the philosophical point the speakers have already decided to make. This is not how historical transmission works. This is how allegory works. And yet the belief that Atlantis was real has persisted not despite the lack of evidence, but in a way that seems almost immune to it. Every failed search, every candidate location ruled out, every geological analysis that doesn't quite fit, none of it diminishes the conviction of the people looking. If anything, it deepens it. There are now more proposed locations for Atlantis than at any point in history. Antarctica, the Caribbean, the Azores, coastal Spain, the Black Sea, the North Sea, Cyprus, Ireland. The list is not shrinking. Geologist Sean Da Silva at Oregon State University, who studies ancient volcanic events, has described the Atlantis search as a perfect example of what he calls retrofitting, taking a fixed conclusion and working backward through the evidence to support it rather than following evidence forward to a conclusion. Every location hypothesis starts with Atlantis being real and works backward to find geology that might, if adjusted, accommodate it. The data doesn't point to Atlantis. Our desire to find it points to Atlantis. And that desire, the need to believe that there was once something magnificent that we have lost, something we could recover, something that would explain why the world feels incomplete, that desire is not a quirk. It is not a failure of reason. It is one of the most persistent features of human consciousness across recorded history. We have been inventing Atlantis since before Plato. We will be inventing it long after every proposed location has been ruled out. Plato wrote that Atlantis sank in a single day and night of misfortune. It's one of the most evocative phrases in ancient literature. A whole civilization, a whole world, gone between sunset and sunrise. Not slowly, not through decay, but suddenly, completely, without survivors who could explain what it had been. In 1974, Spiridon Marinatos, the archaeologist who had spent his career arguing that Thera was Atlantis, who had uncovered Akrotiri's frescoes and its empty streets and its perfectly preserved buildings with no bodies inside, died on the excavation site he loved of a cerebral hemorrhage and was buried at Akrotiri by his own request. He was 72. He died believing he had found what he was looking for. The people who evacuated Akrotiri before the eruption left in such a hurry they left their furniture, their pottery, their grain stores, their frescoes still bright on the walls. They took their people and they went. The city waited under the ash for 3,600 years, perfectly preserved for someone to decide it was worth digging up. Whether it was Atlantis or not, something real was lost there. Something real is always lost. And the reason we keep searching, not just for Atlantis, but for Troy, for El Dorado, for every city we are certain once existed and can no longer find, is not that we believe the archaeology, it's that we cannot accept that magnificent things can disappear without a trace, without a record, without anyone left to say what they were. Plato understood that. He may have been the one who invented the island, but the grief behind it was real.